At exactly 11:42 a.m., the room didn't just quiet down, it forgot how to breathe. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward across the long mahogany table, looked J.D. Vance in the eye, and said 10 words that would ripple across the country by nightfall. The cameras didn't pan, they locked. A New York Times reporter dropped his pen. One intern in the third row mouthed, "Did she just say that?" But J.D. didn't flinch. No reply, no blink, no smirk. Just silence. The kind that makes people uncomfortable, because it sounds too much like strength. Over the next 28 minutes, the narrative would swing, collapse, and rebuild itself. Not because someone shouted louder, but because one man waited long enough for truth to arrive without an invitation. And before we take you inside that moment, where reputations shattered and a forgotten professor rewrote the room, there's something you should know. This story is a dramatized interpretation inspired by real political figures and cultural tensions. Some scenes, dialogue, and events have been fictionalized for narrative impact. But the emotion, the silence, the question it leaves behind, that's as real as it gets. So we ask you, what kind of man says nothing and still wins the room? Stay with us, because sometimes silence isn't what's missing. It's what's speaking loudest. There are questions in politics that feel routine. Then there are questions that change the temperature of a room. "Senator Vance," Jasmine Crockett said, her voice clear, measured, almost too casual for what came next. "For the sake of transparency, would you be willing to release your full college transcript?" There it was. The sentence wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It landed like the snap of a breaking bone in a library, sharp, dry, and impossible to pretend you didn't hear. J.D. Vance blinked once, slowly. His hands remained clasped in front of him, elbows resting gently on the long wooden table. He didn't move. He didn't even shift in his seat, but the room did. You could feel it. Chairs stiffened. Aides froze mid-keystroke. Reporters who had barely looked up from their notes suddenly sat straighter. One of them, an older man from Politico, quietly mouthed, "Did she just say that?" This wasn't in the agenda. It wasn't on the prep notes. It wasn't protocol. It was a strike. Sudden, precise, and loaded. Jasmine sat back slightly in her chair, unfazed. She didn't smirk. She didn't double down. That made it worse. It meant she'd planned it. Not as a jab, but as a trigger. She knew exactly what she was doing. Across the table, J.D. didn't answer. He didn't nod. He didn't frown. But something about the stillness in his face, the complete lack of surprise, told a different story. He had seen this coming. Not today, not here, but eventually. And still, he chose not to speak. The silence that followed was not dead air. It was charged. You could hear the low hum of the lights, the soft whir of a nearby camera, the sound of a single throat clearing 3 rows back. That was it. No one from JD's party objected. No one from the chair interrupted. No staffer leaned in to redirect. It was as if the entire room, from staff to spectators to students in the gallery, had silently decided, "Let's see where this goes." That's when a younger journalist near the back quietly pulled out their phone and began recording. Not because they knew what was about to happen, but because they knew this was the moment that would go viral. Not later, not when the arguments began, but now, in this breathless pause, where a senator was being publicly questioned on something no one had ever dared ask before. "Was your story as clean as you made it sound?" Jasmine didn't repeat her request. She didn't have to. Instead, she added, as if tossing a lit match onto a dry tablecloth, "I mean, if we're setting academic standards, let's make sure we're all above them, not just protected by them." The match caught fire instantly. You could almost hear minds dividing in real time. Some leaned forward in agreement, nodding slowly. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where this was going, but knowing it wouldn't end quietly. And still, J.D. didn't flinch. His silence wasn't passive. It was intentional, heavy, strategic, like a boxer lowering his guard not out of fear, but because he knows the real blow hasn't landed yet. For the first time that morning, someone in the hearing room forgot to breathe. and someone else, seated near the back, whispered the words now being transcribed on a dozen live tweets. This just stopped being a hearing. It's a countdown. The camera didn't cut away. It lingered, long enough for the silence to feel like its own kind of dialogue. J.D. Vance remained motionless, seated beneath a tall, east-facing window where a stream of sunlight filtered down, catching just the right edge of his jaw. The light wasn't flattering, it was honest. It showed every quiet line in his expression, every careful breath. He didn't speak, he didn't smirk, he didn't turn his head. His eyes stayed fixed forward, not on Jasmine, not on the committee chair, but somewhere just beyond the confrontation, like he'd already seen this moment before and decided it didn't deserve his panic. A photographer in the third row zoomed in. No one else was moving. On JD's side of the aisle, two aides sat stiffly, hands gripping notepads they'd stopped writing on minutes ago. One of them slowly pressed the button on their smartwatch, not to check time, but to mark the moment. Something about this didn't feel procedural anymore. It felt historic. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett had folded her hands neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable. She didn't smile, didn't taunt. Her posture was impeccable, calm, certain, and practiced. But the fire was in the words she'd already spoken, not the silence she now held. And everyone knew it. JD wasn't looking at her, but every lens was. A reporter for the Washington Post scribbled a line in the margin of their notebook. Vance sits still, but did he just lose? Another journalist from CNN leaned toward her colleague and whispered, "If this was a debate, he's behind by silence." But another voice, older, quieter, sitting near the back of the room, shook their head and said, No, he's not losing, he's absorbing." And that was exactly what JD's face said. Not submission, not shock, absorption. As if every word Jasmine had just spoken was now being filed, layer by layer, into some internal archive for a response not yet spoken. Maybe not even meant for today, maybe for years later, maybe never. But it was being taken in, not ignored. Sunlight continued to trace the edge of his face as the moment stretched. Not a blink, not a twitch. One cameraman shifted his position slightly, thinking perhaps JD might finally speak, react, clear his throat, anything. But nothing came, just that same unwavering gaze, neither hard nor soft, but precise, controlled, intentional. And still no one dared interrupt. It wasn't just out of respect, it was tension, raw and electric. Because when someone is supposed to defend themselves and they don't, when they just hold, the entire room begins to question what they thought they knew about strength. Jasmine's words still echoed quietly in the room. If we're setting standards, let's make sure we're all above them. But it was the absence of JD's reply that lingered longer. Not because it was empty, but because it was deliberate. People don't always remember the best rebuttal, but they remember when someone refuses to give one. In that silence, J.D. Vance became something else, not a senator, not a defendant, not even a man being challenged. He became the mirror. And everyone, every aide, every journalist, every student in the gallery, had to look into that stillness and ask themselves, what do I see in a man who chooses not to blink? And somewhere outside that room, far beyond Capitol Hill, millions of viewers would soon do the same. Because this moment, quiet, unflinching, and unresolved, was no longer about a transcript. It was about how truth behaves when cornered. And J.D. Vance was still not blinking. The silence didn't stay in the room. It leaked. By the time the hearing reached its 24th minute, clips had already begun circulating on social media. Some were raw recordings taken from phones in the gallery, others screen-grabbed from live-stream feeds with barely filtered captions. The frame was always the same. J.D. Vance, still and composed under a wash of filtered sunlight, with Jasmine's sharp words hanging frozen in midair. No response, no blink, no exit. And yet somehow it was his silence that everyone was reacting to. On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag released the transcript shot up the political trending board within 12 minutes. Close behind it, hashtag academic integrity now, hashtag what is JDH hiding, and curiously, hashtag he didn't flinch. The last one not driven by policy wonks or journalists, but by users describing themselves as veterans, teachers, even stay-at-home parents. The comment sections told the deeper story. Say what you will, but that man's calm scares people, one user posted. Another wrote, when someone's accused and doesn't even blink, you either think they're guilty or they're holding something bigger than guilt. Newsrooms picked up the energy instantly. MSNBC ran a breaking segment titled, Did Crockett just corner Vance? While Fox News took the opposite route with J.D. Vance under fire. But why the silence? Screens across America split into side-by-sides, one with Jasmine mid-sentence, the other with J.D.'s unmoved expression. Still, he said nothing. The silence, at first interpreted as hesitation, began to evolve. It was no longer about J.D.'s reaction. It became about ours. People didn't know whether they were witnessing a collapse or something calculated. And that doubt, that inability to decode him, made the moment grow teeth. In Capitol Hill cafeterias, committee staffers debated whether the senator had been blindsided or whether he'd been waiting for this moment all along. In university forums, law students dissected body language frame by frame, the angle of his shoulders, the way his hands didn't clench, how he kept eye contact with something, someone, no one else could see. Outside the hearing, a group of student protesters had already chalked "Truth doesn't need volume" onto the sidewalk steps. They hadn't even waited for the hearing to end. One of them told a local NPR affiliate, I didn't come here because I support Vance. I came because I know what it feels like to be accused and not be given the space to breathe before you're expected to answer. And through it all, J.D. stayed still. The same folded hands, the same set jaw, the same refusal to blink his way out of pressure. But something had changed, not in him, but around him. The room was no longer watching Jasmine. They were no longer watching a political showdown. They were watching him, not to see if he'd break, but to find out what it meant that he hadn't. What started as a demand for transparency had become something far harder to pin down. A test of perception. Was silence strength? Was it avoidance? Or was it, perhaps, the only answer a man could give when every other word would be called a performance? The question was no longer what J.D. Vance would say next. The question was, who exactly was being exposed here? And in that moment, as the headlines spun and timelines ignited, the country kept watching. Not because he was speaking, but because he wasn't. By the time the hearing resumed after a short procedural pause, the atmosphere hadn't cooled. If anything, it had thickened. The silence that once held the room now buzzed with whispers, speculation, and a faint hum of digital urgency. Because during the recess, something had dropped. An EdaLeaks post. Anonymous, time-stamped just under 10 minutes ago, already reposted hundreds of times across Reddit, Discord, and law school subthreads. The title was vague but baited, When Perseverance Masked Privilege, a Yale Memory. Jasmine Crockett, back in her seat with a glass of water she hadn't touched, tapped her tablet twice, adjusted her mic, and spoke with a calm so precise it felt like a knife being set on a courtroom table. I'd like to read something that's just come to my attention. It was published moments ago on EdaLeaks. I'll quote directly. There was once a student at Yale Law, we'll call him V, who requested multiple exam delays during his final semester. The reasons were vaguely described as emotional stress and family obligations. But those close to the registrar's office knew the truth. There were no emergencies, no hospitalization, no funeral, just pressure. And he cracked. They called it perseverance. I call it privilege. She let the last line hang. No inflection, no commentary. She didn't look at J.D. She didn't have to. Everyone else already was. J.D. remained motionless, the only visible shift being a slow tightening of the corners of his mouth. Not a frown, not surprise, just something behind the eyes, a slow registering of where this was headed. Jasmine continued, now without reading. We talk about equity in education, but equity means more than statistics. It means accountability. If a student of color had asked for that same delay, Would they have received it? Or would they have been told, push through or fail like the rest? A few gasps, subtle but audible. Even on Capitol Hill, those words hit with force. Across the press gallery, journalists weren't writing anymore. They were typing, fast. Phones buzzed. One aide near the back stood abruptly and walked out, whispering into an earpiece. The room was no longer a room. It was a pressure cooker, and still J.D. Vance said nothing. A man known for fierce opinion columns, for rising from Appalachian poverty to best-selling books, for speeches that rattled conference halls, now sat wordless, his name only implied, but his identity unmistakable. The HUMILIATES post didn't have to say J.D. Vance. It didn't have to. Everyone already knew. The initials were deliberate. The timing was no coincidence. And the message, subtle as a brick through glass, had landed. He took in a breath, slowly. His hands folded tighter, then loosened again. His eyes moved. Not to Jasmine, not to the press, but downward, briefly, as if checking whether the ground was still there. Jasmine turned a page in her binder and looked straight ahead. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just patient, as though she were watching a clock wind down. "We don't get to pick which parts of our past deserve scrutiny," she added. "We don't get to tell some students to explain everything, while others float above the questions." It wasn't just an accusation, it was a framing, the kind that turned a senator into a symbol. And symbols, as history shows, don't get to answer for themselves. Not right away. And J.D. Vance, still silent, still in the light, now carried not just his past, but the weight of a room that had shifted from hearing him to judging what he didn't say. The room didn't move at first. No one quite knew how. Jasmine Crockett had delivered her strike. The HUMILIATES post was already headline material, and J.D. Vance sat, immobile, as if time belonged to him now. But silence, while powerful, cannot last forever. Not in politics, and especially not in a room this crowded with tension. It was then, after nearly a full minute of stillness, that J.D. finally adjusted his microphone. The sound was subtle, but it carried. Every person in the room heard it. Every pen paused. Every camera leaned in just a little closer. This wasn't going to be a speech. They knew that already. This wasn't even going to be a defense. It was a single line, a thread pulled carefully through a needle no one else could see. "If I was ever weak," he said, his voice low and precise, "it taught me how to walk forward stronger." No rebuttal, no denial, no mention of the post. Just that. 12 words, and nothing more. But somehow, those 12 words landed heavier than any denial would have. There was something in the delivery, not rehearsed, but remembered, as if the words had been stored for a long time, tucked into a corner of his story that didn't get told in campaign ads or book tours. The cadence was calm, unshaken, almost intimate. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes didn't even lift from the paper in front of her, but the corners of her mouth shifted slightly. Not a smile, not quite satisfaction, but recognition. The trap had been set, and J.D. had just stepped into it. Not because he confessed, but because he answered at all. Reporters scrambled to find the subtext. Was this an admission? A redirection? A philosophical dodge? No one knew, but everyone wrote it down. On social media, the quote was clipped, subtitled, repeated over 100,000 times within the hour. Influencers debated its meaning. Pundits dissected the tone. Someone overlaid it on black and white footage of J.D. walking through a cornfield, turning the moment into something almost cinematic. The internet didn't wait for full context. It didn't need it. The line was ambiguous enough to serve both sides. One side called it dignity, the other deflection. Inside the room, however, it had a different effect. The silence that followed wasn't relieved. It was unsettled. Not because J.D. had said too little, but because he'd said exactly enough to make no one sure what to think. It was the kind of response that defied a clear headline. And in Washington, D.C., uncategorized means dangerous. Jasmine slowly closed the binder in front of her, tapping one finger once against the cover. That was the only response she gave. Not verbal, not emotional. But she knew what had just happened. The moment had entered another phase. Now it was about perception. Was J.D. Vance dodging because there was truth in the accusation? Or was he refusing to explain himself because he believed the truth should not be forced from a place of pressure? A younger congressman on the left side of the chamber leaned toward his aide and whispered, "Why does it feel like he's not losing?" The aide replied, "Because sometimes saying less makes people afraid you know more." And that was the paradox. J.D. Vance hadn't denied anything. He hadn't confirmed anything either. But his stillness and now, his single sharp sentence, had put the room in limbo. The facts were unclear. The post was anonymous. The memory unverifiable. But now with a single response, J.D. had changed the question entirely. It wasn't, did he do it? It was, what kind of man answers like that? And why does it still echo? The room had barely absorbed J.D. Vance's single sentence when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward again. Not urgently, but with the careful weight of someone who knew exactly how much pressure a bridge could take before it cracked. She didn't raise her voice, didn't change her tone. She simply opened a thin, manila folder that had been sitting beside her since the hearing began. The gesture was unhurried, but the energy shifted. Again. "Before we all applaud resilience," she said calmly, "I'd like to introduce one more perspective, from someone who actually saw it firsthand." She lifted a printed sheet from the folder, her thumb resting gently along the margin. The pages were slightly curled at the corners, well handled but deliberate. "This," she continued, "is a written statement from a former faculty advisor at Yale Law. The name is redacted, but the memory isn't." She paused, then read, "In my time as a professor, I've guided many students through academic pressure. One in particular stands out, not for his performance but for the inconsistency between the myth and the record. While his public narrative leans heavily on hardship, the reality is that this student, initials JV, received multiple accommodations during his final year. Some were undocumented, some were contested by the registrar's office. In one case, a scheduled oral defense was waived entirely without justification. I do not write this to humiliate. I write it to question what we call merit." Another pause. Not for effect, but for gravity. Somewhere near the back, someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. Another person nodded, and then it happened. An unmistakable moment of fracture. Soft applause. Just a few hands at first, almost unsure if they should commit. But they did. The sound grew, not into a standing ovation, but into something more dangerous. Moral affirmation. They were choosing sides. J.D. didn't move. His hands remained calmly folded on the table, his face unreadable, but his left thumb now tapped lightly against the pad of his index finger, a small, rhythmic movement only visible to the most observant. Not anger, not panic, just motion, a tether to the moment. Jasmine lowered the page, her gaze not on J.D., but on the rest of the committee. "This isn't about bringing someone down," she said, her voice steady. "It's about asking whether we're willing to examine the standards we enforce, and more importantly, the ones we quietly let slide." The division in the room deepened. On one side, staffers leaned forward, eyes locked on Jasmine as if awaiting the next citation. On the other, aides exchanged wary glances, silently weighing whether this line of questioning had gone too far or not far enough. Reporters typed with renewed speed, capturing the shift, not just in content, but in tone. The air wasn't heavy anymore. It was polarized, and polarization had its own momentum. A law student seated in the public gallery whispered, "This is turning into something bigger than transcripts." Her friend nodded, eyes still fixed on J.D. "It already is," because in that moment, the hearing was no longer about education policy or academic equity. It was about memory, myth, and the cost of a narrative. And as the applause faded and the eyes turned again toward the man who still hadn't spoken beyond a single sentence, one truth became clear. Silence could protect you until it looked like you had something to hide. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't done pushing yet. The door to the hearing chamber creaked open, not loud but distinct, enough to interrupt the rustle of notes and shifting bodies, enough for every head to turn. Framed in the doorway stood an old man, shoulders slightly hunched but presence undiminished. He wore a brown wool coat that had outlasted at least a decade's worth of Washington winters, and in his right hand was a carved wooden cane with initials faintly worn into the handle, WH. No one called for security. They didn't need to. Those who recognized him said his name under their breath, some in respect, others in disbelief. Professor William Hart. He hadn't been seen in public since his retirement 3 years ago. He'd taught constitutional law at Yale and later guest lectured at Howard. He'd once written the syllabus that both J.D. Vance and Jasmine Crockett had studied under. Different years, different politics, but the same chalk dust under their nails. Hart took 3 slow steps forward and then stopped, resting both hands on the cane now. His voice, when it came, didn't rise, but the room obeyed it. Madam Chair, if I may, I have no official capacity here, but I have standing in truth, and I taught both of those two sitting before you. A quiet ripple passed through the committee. No one interrupted. The chair nodded once, giving him the floor without speaking. I've watched from afar, first the transcripts, then the leaks, then the insinuations. I'm not here to rescue either of them. I'm here because I've seen how institutions bend over time, sometimes gently, sometimes under the heat of political spectacle. He turned slightly, facing J.D. first. His gaze didn't waver. Mr. Vance, you were brilliant, and you were brittle. I remember when your mother visited you on campus, unannounced, and you skipped the mock trial to walk with her around the library. I remember when you asked for an extension on your final paper, not because of an excuse, but because you couldn't bring yourself to fake your way through a citation. You never wanted shortcuts. But yes, some were handed to you anyway. Doors opened quietly, often without you asking. That doesn't make you guilty, but it does make you chosen. J.D. said nothing. His jaw clenched once, then softened again. Then Hart turned to Jasmine. Ms. Crockett, you challenged me every week in class. Not rudely, relentlessly. You corrected case law I'd quoted from memory and once asked me in front of 40 students whether I still believed the Constitution protected everyone equally, or only those who could afford to litigate it. You weren't given shortcuts. You built your own roads. Jasmine's eyes didn't leave his. I came not to pick a side, Hart said, but to remind this room and this country that sometimes 2 things can be true. One student worked through the fire, the other carried it with her, but both were mine, and we do ourselves no justice by weaponizing their paths against each other. He turned back to the room, leveling his gaze not at the committee members, but at the cameras, the silent jury beyond the screen. This isn't just about who deserves what. It's about whether we can still recognize the difference between a flaw and a fraud. No applause followed, just stillness. Hart gave a slight nod, tapped his cane once to the floor and turned to leave. No one stopped him. He hadn't taken a side, but he'd redrawn the battlefield. And outside the hearing, the internet raged louder than ever, because now both J.D. and Jasmine were under the same lens. And for the first time, no one was sure who it would burn first. Professor Hart stood a few feet from the hearing table, his hand still gently resting on the head of his cane. The lights didn't flicker. The cameras didn't blink. But something in the air felt still, almost reverent. I said I wouldn't take sides, he began again, quieter this time. And I won't. But I have 2 stories, both of them true, both of them old, and both of them matter more than whatever sound bites might follow this moment. He glanced at the committee, then turned slightly toward J.D. Vance. Years ago, Hart said, a student walked into my office the morning of his final exam. I knew the name, knew the story, raised by his grandparents, escaped a town that didn't expect him to finish high school, much less law school. That morning he looked like someone who hadn't slept, not out of laziness, but from carrying something heavier. Hart's voice stayed level, but his words slowed. The silence around him deepened. He said, Professor, I'm sorry to ask. My family fell apart last night. I can't even reach my mother. I'm not ready to sit in that room and pretend I'm okay. Hart paused. He didn't look at J.D. again. He just nodded gently to the air. I approve the extension. He let that sentence breathe. No defense, no shame, just a fact. Then he turned, softly, slowly, to face Jasmine. A different year, a different kind of day, A student submitted a senior thesis by hand, no fanfare. Just a black binder slid across my desk. He blinked once, and then his voice cracked. Not with weakness, but with weight. That same afternoon, I received a call from the dean. He told me the student's mother had passed that morning. The room froze. She never asked for an extension, never said a word. I found out after I'd already graded her paper. Jasmine didn't move, but her jaw tightened. She didn't nod, didn't flinch, only locked eyes with Hart and let the silence do the rest. I never forgot either moment, he said. Not because one was stronger or one was weaker, but because both were human, and because somewhere along the way, we've started pretending that grace is a synonym for corruption, or that pride can only be proven by suffering in silence. A reporter scribbled something quickly. Another just stared, pen frozen midair. These are not accusations, Hart continued. These are records, memories, lessons. A boy asked for space to breathe. A girl gave up her own air so she wouldn't fall behind. He didn't speak for 10 full seconds. It felt like 20. What you choose to do with that information is not up to me. I'm not your judge. I'm not even your witness. I'm just someone who remembers. Hart slowly took a step back, his shoes quiet on the marble floor. For the first time, he looked tired. I once believed education was about answers, he said almost to himself. Now I think it's about what we do with the truth when it doesn't make either side feel safe. The chair didn't call time. No one motioned to cut him off. And in that stillness, JD didn't speak. Jasmine didn't rise. But the weight between them, the contrast, the cost, the choices, hung in the air like the quiet before a storm. It wasn't about guilt anymore. It was about whether the country was even ready to hear what fairness looked like when it wasn't symmetrical. The room still hadn't shifted when Professor Hart reached slowly into his weathered leather bag. From it, he pulled two thin folders, each worn at the edges, held together by a single black clip. The kind of folders that collect dust in locked drawers for decades until someone remembers what they meant. He raised the first, a navy blue cover with a faint, handwritten title, Compassion in Lawmaking, the Moral Burden of Policy. This, Hart said softly, was J.D. Vance's final paper in my legislative ethics course. It came in after the extension, 2 weeks late. But what lived inside it, he tapped the folder gently, was something I've only read a handful of times in all my years. J.D.'s eyes didn't flicker. He simply looked at the paper as though he already knew what it contained and what it cost to write. Hart opened it, scanning silently, as if rereading a long-forgotten letter from a friend who never asked to be remembered. He wrote about empathy not as a weakness, but as a legislative force, about how laws passed in silence can wound louder than words ever will. He didn't just quote philosophers, he quoted his grandmother. There was the briefest sound, a sniffle maybe, from someone in the back row. Hart didn't pause. He lowered the folder, then raised the second. This, he continued, is Jasmine Crockett's thesis, titled Unequal Protections, Race, Evidence, and the Disparity of Civil Rights Trials in American Courts. This time he didn't open it immediately. He held it with both hands almost reverently. It came in the same week her mother died. I know now because of what the registrar told me months later, not because she ever mentioned it. Jasmine looked down, not out of shame, but to breathe. She didn't need the room's sympathy. She needed its attention to stay fixed on what mattered. Hart opened the second folder. She didn't ask for extra time, but she found time somehow to include stories from courtrooms in Mississippi, Ferguson, and East Texas. She compared sentencing disparities, tracked legal patterns where evidence said one thing, but the outcome screamed another. He closed both folders. These are two of the best pieces I've ever graded, and they couldn't be more different. One looked outward at how law could be made better by understanding human fragility. The other looked inward at how the law had failed again and again to recognize some people's full humanity. He looked up now, not at J.D., not at Jasmine, but at everyone. I taught both. Hart placed the folders side by side on the witness table. His voice dropped, but the room leaned in closer. But only one asked for time off. A murmur flickered through the press row, barely audible. And it wasn't because they were lazy, Hart finished. It was because they knew when to pause and come back stronger. He stepped back, his cane tapping once on the marble tile. That was all. No hero crowned, no villain condemned, just two essays, two decisions. And the quiet reminder that sometimes the most defining choice a person can make is when to stop and breathe before they keep going. It started with a shaky phone video. A student in the fourth row, hoodie, earbuds, barely paying attention until that moment, had propped his phone against a binder. The angle was crooked, the lighting uneven, but what it captured was clearer than any broadcast camera could offer. J.D. Vance, sitting motionless, hands folded, eyes forward. Professor Hart's voice floated in the background, calm and unwavering. I taught both. But only one asked for time off, and it wasn't because they were lazy. It was because they knew when to pause and come back stronger. And then, just before the clip ended, came the line that would break the internet. No one needs to shout to tell the truth. That sentence hung in the silence. J.D. didn't blink. He didn't nod. He didn't look at Jasmine. He just remained there, present, still, and somehow louder than everyone else in the room. The clip hit TikTok an hour later, posted with the caption, "This is how you answer without speaking. Hashtag JD Vance, hashtag Congress hearing." It was reposted, then remixed, then captioned with music swelling under Hart's words, mixed with slow-motion shots of JD's unmoving stare. In 10 hours, it had 5 million views. By morning, the phrase hashtag he didn't need to speak was trending #1 on Twitter. Instagram Reels followed suit. Clips of the hearing room, cuts of JD entering and exiting in silence, overlaid with quotes in bold white text. On Facebook, older veterans, many of whom had never heard of Jasmine or JD until this moment, began sharing the moment with one-line captions. That's leadership. Sometimes you win by staying grounded. Reminds me of someone I served with. The clip jumped networks. MSNBC ran a segment titled, "When Silence Speaks Louder." Fox News framed it as Vance outclasses Crockett without saying a word. CNN called it the power of poise. But the reaction wasn't one-sided. Jasmine's supporters clapped back with hashtag what about the records, flooding threads with reminders. The question still stood. The transcripts hadn't surfaced. The allegations weren't disproven. Silence, they argued, wasn't courage. It was convenience. Still, the tone had shifted. Something in JD's stillness unnerved people. Not because it was evasive, but because it was so deliberate. In a world wired for noise where every politician seemed to reach first for the microphone, JD's refusal to grab the airspace read like strategy, or strength, or both. He didn't clap back, didn't tweet, didn't offer a soundbite or statement, just disappeared behind a closed door as the world argued over what his silence meant. And maybe that was the point. That night, a college professor in Ohio used the clip to open her ethics class. "What is truth?" she asked, pausing the video mid-sentence. "Is it what you say or what others say about your silence?" In a DC bar, lobbyists whispered about whether JD had rehearsed the move. It was clean, one said. Too clean, like he knew that moment would be clipped. In Texas, Jasmine scrolled through her feed in her hotel room, the volume off. Just the looping image of JD staring forward, again and again. The comments were endless. "Dude blinked less than a sniper. When your stillness scares everyone more than shouting." This is the face of someone who's playing chess while others argue checkers. She didn't comment. She didn't repost. But she didn't flinch either, because something told her this wasn't over. The clip may have shaken the feed, but it hadn't settled the story, and she still had questions, still had receipts. And next time, JD would have to say something. By noon the next day, something strange started happening. A few mainstream outlets, large, respected, trusted, aired abbreviated versions of the viral clip. JD's stillness remained. Hart's final line, "No one needs to shout to tell the truth," stayed. But something was missing. Gone were Hart's earlier words, the ones about JD asking for an exam delay, during a time of family collapse. Gone was the quiet humanity behind JD's request, the struggle, the fracture, the very detail that had given the moment its moral weight. At first, no one noticed, but the internet is faster than editors. A side-by-side comparison hit Reddit like a grenade. One user spliced the original TikTok version next to the network's clean clip. He titled it simply, "Notice anything missing?" Within an hour, the comments section exploded. So they're trying to make JD look like a statue instead of a story? That line about his family made the clip. Without it, it's just performative silence. If they edited it out, it must have mattered. By evening, the backlash had grown teeth. A trending thread on X read, #WhatTheyCutMatters. A top comment read, "Editing out empathy is still lying." Suddenly, the story wasn't just about JD's silence. It was about who controlled the silence and why. Talk shows scrambled to adjust. On The View, one host angrily held up a printed transcript of Hart's full statement. "This is journalism 101. You don't get to cut the hard parts just because they don't fit the headline." On Fox News, a guest shot back, "If JD really wanted the full story told, he should have told it himself. Silence doesn't come with context." But others disagreed. One retired veteran called into a local radio show. He didn't need to explain. Hart did it for him. And if they cut that truth out, shame on them, not him. Late-night comedians jumped in too. Jimmy Kimmel showed the full version on air, then raised a brow. "So let me get this straight. When a man stays silent, they make him a hero. But when that silence includes a reason, suddenly the hero's too human?" Laughter, applause. But the subtext hit hard. Across the country, old wounds resurfaced. About class, about merit, about who gets to be seen as strong and who gets airbrushed for convenience. Jasmine noticed too. Back in D.C., she watched a news segment showing the shortened clip and shook her head. "They're rewriting the moment," she told her aide. "They're scrubbing out the complexity." The aide replied, "Or maybe they're afraid of it." Outside the Capitol, protesters began holding up signs reading, "Don't edit our struggle. Full clip or no clip." One poster simply had a handwritten quote, "Truth without detail is just propaganda." As the noise grew, JD Vance still didn't respond. No post, no clarification, no interview. And yet the pressure around him intensified. Some praised his restraint. He's rising above it. Others questioned his strategy. If you don't control the narrative, someone else will. The irony? His silence had made him famous. But now the parts of his silence that mattered, the reasons, the roots, were being erased by those who claimed to admire it. In a world obsessed with who speaks louder, JD Vance had become the center of a storm for not speaking at all. But as the edits continued and the public rage mounted, one thing became increasingly clear. Silence can make you powerful, but only if the truth behind it is left untouched. And someone had just touched it. The building had emptied for the night. Fluorescent lights buzzed low. Outside her Capitol office window, traffic lights blinked red and gold onto near-empty streets. But inside, Jasmine Crockett sat alone. No staff, no cameras, just the dull thrum of quiet. She was staring at a single letter, handwritten, blue ink, careful loops, folded once. The envelope bore no return address, just a zip code from Ohio. She unfolded it slowly. The note began simply, "Dear Representative Crockett, my name is Caleb. I'm 17. You probably don't read every letter, but I hope this one makes it." Jasmine exhaled softly, leaning back, letting the voice of a stranger reach her without defense. "I watch your speeches online. I think you're brilliant. You make people listen when they don't want to. You make people care. But this time, with JD Vance, I don't know. It felt different." She read that line twice. "You asked tough questions. That's fair. But when the old professor spoke, I saw something else. Maybe you were right to push. Maybe he was right to pause. But I just wanted you to know, not everyone watching wanted a winner. Some of us just wanted the truth. I still admire you. I just think you went too far." The signature at the bottom was clumsy. Caleb J. Reynolds, Youngstown High School. Jasmine sat motionless. There was no anger in her face, no shame either, just a tight, long stillness, like someone standing on the edge of something they hadn't expected to see below. She placed the letter gently on her desk, next to a thick file marked Hearing Admissions Inquiry. The contrast was sharp. One voice from the street beside a pile of voices from the state. She stared at the letter again. Not everyone wanted a winner. She let the words echo, not just in the room, but in her mind. It wasn't that she felt guilty. She believed in accountability. She always had. She'd fought too long, too hard, to soften her fire for comfort. But something in Caleb's words brushed against a part of her she hadn't touched in weeks. The one that remembered what it meant to listen rather than to win. Her eyes wandered to the window again. Across the avenue, a traffic light turned green, then yellow, then red, and still she didn't move. In the hallway beyond her office, a janitor's cart rolled past. The faint squeak of wheels echoed down the marble floor. She whispered to herself, not regretfully, but with clarity, you can't build justice on edits, and you can't chase truth with vengeance. She picked up a pen, not for a speech, not for a rebuttal, just a clean sheet of paper. At the top she wrote, "Truth is not a contest." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a reversal, but it was a beginning of something inward, a thought she'd carry into the next round, a line she'd remember when the room was loud again. Outside, the Capitol stayed lit, but inside, one woman sat in the dark, not defeated, not defiant, just deeply, powerfully still. The post appeared without fanfare. No blue check, no dramatic caption, just a screenshot, grainy, slightly pixelated, of an old email dated April 17th, 2008. The sender jd.vance@lawschool.edu. The subject line, request to reschedule final exam. The recipient was unmistakable, Professor W. Hart. At first it didn't catch much traction. It was buried beneath newer hashtags, newer reactions. But a journalist for a small investigative blog, someone who had followed the hearing closely, retweeted it with a single line. Sometimes a whole man lives in one paragraph. That's when it took off. The email read, Professor Hart, I'm writing to ask if I may delay my final exam by 1 week. My mother relapsed again this morning, and I had to leave to help my younger siblings. I don't want special treatment. I just need space to return stronger. I've been keeping up with readings on the bus, and I'll make up the time. But today I had to be there for them. Thank you for understanding either way. Respectfully, J.D. Vance. No legal defense, no press conference, no clever framing, just raw necessity on digital paper. It was 113 words, and it cracked open a silence that had been holding the country in suspense. The repost came fast, then the think pieces, then the reactions that weren't polished or political, just human. I've been JD, trying to hold it all together when nobody's watching. He didn't ask for a pass. He asked for a chance. Big difference. This isn't about politics anymore. This is about what we forget people carry when they walk into a room. The email traveled. Teachers printed it and taped it to their doors. Because every student is fighting something we don't see, one wrote. Veterans groups reposted it with the tag, #StrengthUs. Quiet, even Jasmine saw it. Late at night, alone again. She stared at her phone, the soft blue glow illuminating her face. The same JD who had sat across from her in silence. That stillness now made sense. It wasn't retreat. It wasn't smug. It was the strength of someone who had once asked in private to be allowed to break quietly. She exhaled deeply. This wasn't what she had expected the week to become, but maybe that was the point. Truth doesn't arrive with applause. It slips in quietly when nobody's performing. The next morning, news anchors had little to add. Some just read the email aloud and let it sit. A high school civics teacher in Georgia started her class by projecting it on the board. Before we argue, she told her students, let's learn to recognize when something is simply real. The realness spread, and in that quiet, something shifted, not in favor or against JD, but towards something rare, compassion. Because whether you supported him or not, There was no denying this. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't deflected. He hadn't blamed. He had simply, 17 years ago, typed out the one thing so many people still struggle to say, "I just need space to return stronger." And somehow, in the middle of national noise, that quiet line became the one people couldn't forget. The studio lights were soft. No applause, no dramatics. Just the steady voice of a man who had spent a lifetime trying to teach, not impress. Professor William Hart sat opposite the PBS anchor, gray tie loosely knotted, eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, calm but unflinching. He didn't flinch much these days, especially not over J.D. Vance. The anchor leaned forward. "Professor Hart, the country has seen the email. Some believe it changes everything. Some say it changes nothing. But your words at the hearing about both J.D. and Jasmine sparked a national wave. Were you defending J.D. Vance?" Hart gave a small shake of the head, more contemplative than dismissive. "I wasn't defending J.D., he said plainly. I was telling what he never said out loud, to protect his dignity." There was a stillness that followed. Not tension, not awe, just reverence. The kind that comes when an older voice refuses to spin, only to clarify. Hart adjusted his glasses and continued. "You see, people forget. They forget how much silence costs. J.D. didn't raise his hand and say, 'Let me tell you about my broken home.' He didn't build a career off his struggle. He asked for time, took it, and came back." He paused. "That email, now everyone's reading it. But for years, he let it sleep in someone else's inbox. Because dignity doesn't need a spotlight. It only needs to survive." The anchor nodded slowly. "But what about Jasmine Crockett? Some say you undermined her by humanizing J.D. Hart," smiled sadly. "That's not what I did. What Jasmine did, holding people accountable, is necessary. I've admired her fire since she was a student. But fairness doesn't ask us to pit stories against each other. It asks us to hold them side by side." A clip rolled behind him. The hearing room, Jasmine's voice sharp, J.D. unmoved, and his own words echoing from that day. "I taught both." The camera returned to Hart, whose voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "I've taught senators, judges, janitors, and what I've learned is this: pain isn't a competition. Neither is strength." The anchor let that sit. Hart leaned back and glanced slightly off camera, as if seeing someone who wasn't there. "I once had a rule in my classroom," he said, voice steady. "If you needed time, you asked. But if you stayed silent, I kept an eye on you anyway." He looked into the lens now. "I kept an eye on J.D. A silence followed. No need to fill it. Then the anchor asked gently, "Do you regret saying any of it publicly?" Hart smiled, but not with pride. It was the weary smile of a man who knew the weight of words. "I regret that it had to be said out loud for people to see it." He stood as the interview ended, shaking hands, brushing off offers for a car service. Outside the studio, the sidewalk was empty. His cane clicked with each step, steady and slow. Later that night, PBS aired the interview in full. No edits, no sound bites. Just the full story of a man who had once given a student a week of grace, and another the courage to never ask for it. And across the country, people sat with one sentence. Quietly powerful, quietly unforgettable. "I wasn't defending J.D. I was telling what he never said out loud, to protect his dignity." It began with a bar graph, no headlines, no commentary, just a quiet update at the bottom of the morning news. J.D. Vance favorability surges after PBS interview. Within hours, it was everywhere. In Chicago, a diner played it on a small TV perched above the register. The cook paused mid-order. "I thought he was finished," he muttered. A waitress nodded slowly. "Yeah, but that professor made you think twice, didn't he?" On phones across the country, one line repeated like a chorus. He didn't defend himself, but someone who knew him did. A national survey released that afternoon showed the impact. 71% said J.D. had acted honorably throughout the ordeal. 67% said his silence had spoken louder than any speech ever could. 58% of former skeptics admitted they had underestimated him. And the most telling figure of all, 83% of respondents aged 45 to 65, those who had lived long enough to see the value of restraint, called his silence the most dignified moment in recent politics. It wasn't just the numbers. It was the language that came with them. He didn't play the victim. He let the fire burn itself out. He stood still while the world screamed, and that steadiness said something none of us could ignore. Cable pundits scrambled to recalibrate. Some begrudgingly praised his media discipline. Others speculated whether this was calculated all along, but even the loudest voices couldn't shake the weight of what Hart had said, or how JD had never tried to steer the conversation once it left his hands. Meanwhile, Jasmine's camp released no new statements. Her supporters remained vocal, but even they were beginning to fracture. Some said she had asked the hard questions no one else would. Others whispered that she may have overplayed her hand. But what none could deny was this: the mood had shifted. Not because JD had proven innocence, but because he had refused to plead it. In a Florida retirement community, a woman named Arlene, white-haired, sharp-eyed, a former teacher, wrote a letter to her local paper. It was reprinted the next morning. "We taught our children to speak up when needed, and also to sit still when dignity required it." JD reminded me of that second lesson. I had nearly forgotten it existed in politics. By nightfall, late-night hosts tried their best to mock the story back into controversy, but their punchlines missed the mark. The audience didn't laugh. They didn't boo. They just sat with it. In Capitol offices, advisors watched focus groups in stunned silence. JD wasn't trending because he clapped back. He was trending because he didn't, and that was harder to fight. One strategist finally broke the hush. "When you get called out and you still win the room by saying nothing," she whistled, "that's not luck, that's legacy." Back in Ohio, JD sat with his team, reviewing none of the news. His phone buzzed. A staffer handed it to him. Another poll update. He looked at the screen, then put the phone down. Just one sentence escaped his lips. Barely a whisper, but unshakably firm. "Let's not chase the numbers. Let's just keep standing still." 3 days after the polls came out, Jasmine sat at her desk long after the Hill had gone quiet. Her office light glowed dim against the dusk outside, where the Capitol dome was just beginning to fade into silhouette. Papers were stacked to the left, unread. A cup of coffee gone cold. But in front of her, centered neatly on a yellow legal pad, sat a blank sheet of cream stationery and an uncapped black pen. For the first time in years, her hands hesitated. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pride. It was something more fragile. Understanding. She had watched the clip more times than she cared to admit. The moment Professor Hart raised those 2 essays. JD's posture, straight but never smug. The silence. The way it stretched like a bridge over everything they had thrown at each other. No rebuttals, no rehearsed lines, no counterattacks, just stillness that refused to sink. Jasmine took a breath, then began to write. "Dear JD, I've given speeches that set rooms on fire. I've argued until I couldn't speak. But something about the way you didn't respond made me feel like the loudest voices weren't always the ones doing the work. I used to think strength was how loud you could speak. Now I know. It's knowing when not to. You didn't owe the room a performance, and somehow that gave everyone watching more than any debate could have. I don't know where we go from here, but I do know this. For the first time, I didn't feel like I won. I felt like I learned, and that's rarer than any victory." She paused, then signed her name. No title, no flourish. Just Jasmine. She folded the paper carefully, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with her thumb. For a second, she just held it there, letting the weight of it rest against her palm. It wasn't just a letter, it was a shift, a small surrender, a rare kind of peace. Across town, JD was working late too, his garage office lit by a single desk lamp and the soft whir of a floor fan. He didn't expect visitors and certainly not couriers. But when the soft knock came and the envelope was handed over without a word, he immediately knew who it was from. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he stared at the handwriting on the front. Precise, neat, strong, like she always had been. And when he finally did break the seal and read her words, he sat for a long time afterward, watching his own reflection in the darkened window. He didn't smile, didn't sigh, but something loosened in his chest, something he hadn't even known was knotted. In a folder on the table sat the essay he had written all those years ago, Compassion in Lawmaking. Hart's notes still in the margins. He hadn't read it in years. Tonight he would. And in another folder, one he'd quietly kept, was a copy of Jasmine's thesis, Unequal Protections in Civil Rights Trials. He'd never admitted it, but he had reread it once before, the week she was sworn into Congress. Now for the second time, he would read it again. Side by side, two people, two essays, two very different voices. But tonight, for the first time, he didn't feel like they were arguing. For weeks, J.D. Vance had let the media swirl around him like a storm he had no interest in chasing. He had made no statements, held no interviews, and offered not a single clarification. While television panels debated whether his silence was strategic or cowardly, he quietly returned to his routines: garage, gym, Senate floor, home. But on the first Sunday of the month at 8:47 a.m., J.D. did something that no one expected. He posted one sentence, no hashtags, no image, just black text on a white background. I didn't come to defend a name. I came to stay true to what I once wrote. It appeared first on his X profile. Within 6 minutes, it had crossed 200,000 views. Within an hour, over 2 million. Screenshots flooded Facebook, Instagram, Reddit. Every political podcast ran with it. What did he once write? Is this about that old essay? Wait, is this finally his response? Speculation turned into frenzy. Users dug up the essay Professor Hart had mentioned, Compassion in Lawmaking. By midday, it was trending in digital archives across the country. JD hadn't even linked to it. He didn't need to. The internet knew how to find what it wanted. In one viral TikTok, a Gen Z creator held up a printout of the essay and whispered, "This is what quiet strength looks like." The clip ended with a simple line drawn from JD's paper. Laws built without empathy collapse under their own weight. At a library in Kentucky, a middle school civics teacher printed copies of both JD's and Jasmine's essays for class discussion. You don't have to agree with them, she told her students, but you do have to understand how both silence and speech shape the world. Meanwhile, JD's team issued no clarification, no follow-up, nothing. It wasn't a campaign move. It wasn't tied to any legislation. There was no speech scheduled, no camera crew, just a single post from a man who, in the heat of a national controversy, chose not to throw fire, but to hold up a mirror. In comment sections, reactions collided. One user wrote, "This is leadership without the costume." Another replied, "Funny how saying almost nothing is now seen as brave. What happened to accountability?" And then someone else added, "Sometimes silence is the accountability, especially when it makes you go read instead of scroll." The debate stretched across political lines, but something strange happened in the process. People stopped yelling and started reading. Reading old essays, reading transcripts from the hearing, reading Jasmine's letter, now public after she quietly released it in an op-ed titled, "What I Didn't Say That Day." Even her voice, once the sharpest on the floor, had softened. "I came ready to uncover. He came ready to endure," she wrote. And somehow that made us both students again. Inside his garage office, JD refreshed the page just once, then closed the laptop. He hadn't written the sentence for attention. It wasn't for redemption. It was a circle, closing something that had started long before the hearing, before the debate, before the essays. It had started the day he sat down as a young law student and wrote those words not to win, but to try and understand the world he wanted to enter. And now, after weeks of noise, he had said one sentence. 2 million shares, 200,000 comments. But more importantly, he had been heard, not just by critics, not just by fans, by her. It was nearly dusk when JD pulled into the gravel lot of a modest care home nestled on the outskirts of Georgetown. The sun hung low, casting long amber shadows across the hedges and narrow windows. No cameras followed. No aides accompanied him. The only sound was the quiet crunch of his boots against the path. Inside, the front desk staff recognized him. They said nothing beyond a gentle nod and a soft, "He's in the garden room." JD nodded in return. No introductions were needed, not now. He found Professor William Hart sitting alone in a chair near the window, sunlight catching the edges of his silver hair. The cane rested across his lap. On the side table, a worn manila folder and 2 glasses of water, untouched. Hart didn't turn to greet JD when he entered. He didn't need to. JD sat down across from him without speaking. For a moment, it felt like a memory, not the present, like being back in office hours 2 decades ago, when he'd sat on this side of the desk, nervous, guarded, unsure whether his ideas deserved the paper they were printed on. The room carried a weight that didn't require volume. Between them sat that same folder Hart had carried into the hearing, the one with the essays. JD glanced at it, then away. His eyes settled on the old man's hand, resting atop it now with faint tremors that time doesn't forgive. No speeches, no apologies, no clever remarks. Just a pause that felt like a chapter turning. Then slowly, Hart lifted the top sheet from the folder. JD's essay, yellowed slightly at the edges, but the words still clear. Compassion in lawmaking. He held it for a beat, then gently laid his palm on it, and nodded. The gesture didn't ask for explanation, and JD didn't offer one. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't validation. It was something older, quieter, like a craftsman passing a tool back to his apprentice, not because it was needed, but because it had been used well. A quiet ripple passed through the committee. No one interrupted. The chair nodded once, giving him the floor without speaking. I've watched from afar. First the transcripts, then the leaks, then the insinuations. I'm not here to rescue either of them. I'm here because I've seen how institutions bend over time, sometimes gently, sometimes under the heat of political spectacle. He turned slightly, facing JD first. His gaze didn't waver. Mr. Vance, you were brilliant, and you were brittle. I remember when your mother visited you on campus, unannounced, and you skipped the mock trial to walk with her around the library. I remember when you asked for an extension on your final paper, not because of an excuse, but because you couldn't bring yourself to fake your way through a citation. You never wanted shortcuts. But yes, some were handed to you anyway. Doors opened quietly, often without you asking. That doesn't make you guilty, but it does make you chosen. JD said nothing. His jaw clenched once, then softened again. Then Hart turned to Jasmine. Ms. Crockett, you challenged me every week in class, not rudely, relentlessly. You corrected case law I'd quoted from memory, and once asked me in front of 40 students whether I still believed the Constitution protected everyone equally, or only those who could afford to litigate it. You weren't given shortcuts. You built your own roads. Jasmine's eyes didn't leave his. I came not to pick a side, Hart said, but to remind this room and this country that sometimes 2 things can be true. One student worked through the fire, the other carried it with her. But both were mine, and we do ourselves no justice by weaponizing their paths against each other. He turned back to the room, leveling his gaze not at the committee members, but at the cameras, the silent jury beyond the screen. This isn't just about who deserves what, it's about whether we can still recognize the difference between a flaw and a fraud. No applause followed, just stillness. Hart gave a slight nod, tapped his cane once to the floor and turned to leave. No one stopped him. He hadn't taken a side, but he'd redrawn the battlefield. And outside the hearing, the internet raged louder than ever, because now both JD and Jasmine were under the same lens. And for the first time, no one was sure who it would burn first. Professor Hart stood a few feet from the hearing table, his hand still gently resting on the head of his cane. The lights didn't flicker. The cameras didn't blink. But something in the air felt still, almost reverent. I said I wouldn't take sides, he began again, quieter this time, and I won't. But I have 2 stories, both of them true, both of them old, and both of them matter more than whatever sound bites might follow this moment. He glanced at the committee, then turned slightly toward J.D. Vance. Years ago, Hart said, a student walked into my office the morning of his final exam. I knew the name, knew the story, raised by his grandparents, escaped a town that didn't expect him to finish high school, much less law school. That morning, he looked like someone who hadn't slept, not out of laziness, but from carrying something heavier. Hart's voice stayed level, but his words slowed. The silence around him deepened. He said, "Professor, I'm sorry to ask. My family fell apart last night. I can't even reach my mother. I'm not ready to sit in that room and pretend I'm okay." Hart paused. He didn't look at JD again. He just nodded gently to the air. "I approved the extension." He let that sentence breathe. No defense, no shame, just a fact. Then he turned, softly, slowly, to face Jasmine. A different year, a different kind of day. A student submitted a senior thesis by hand. No fanfare, just a black binder slid across my desk. He blinked once, and then his voice cracked, not with weakness, but with weight. That same afternoon, I received a call from the dean. He told me the student's mother had passed that morning. The room froze. She never asked for an extension, never said a word. I found out after I'd already graded her paper. Jasmine didn't move, but her jaw tightened. She didn't nod, didn't flinch, only locked eyes with Hart and let the silence do the rest. "I never forgot either moment," he said, "not because one was stronger or one was weaker, but because both were human, and because somewhere along the way, we've started pretending that grace is a synonym for corruption, or that pride can only be proven by suffering in silence." The day J.D. Vance left the Capitol, the air was thick with cameras and questions. He didn't walk with an entourage or a press secretary, just a simple suit, one button undone, and the same steady walk he'd always had. He moved down the marble steps without rushing, nodding faintly to familiar faces. Reporters leaned over the rope line, calling his name with questions sharpened like darts. "Do you regret not answering sooner? Did you ever lie about your academic past? Do you feel vindicated?" But he kept walking, eyes forward, posture unshaken. Then as he reached the end of the path where the press pack thinned out, a younger reporter, quieter than the others, stepped forward. Not with a microphone, but just with a notepad. "Senator Vance," she asked, "do you think you won?" JD stopped, turned. The cameras noticed. He didn't give a soundbite or strategy line. Just looked the reporter in the eye and gave a small, thoughtful smile. The kind that doesn't need polishing. "I never came to win," he said softly. "I came to stay right with myself." Then he tipped his head once in thanks, turned back, and stepped into the waiting car. The door shut not with a thud but a soft click. That was the last time he publicly addressed the hearing, the transcript, or the controversy. But somehow that single sentence was repeated more times than any defense ever could have been. It was printed on posters, quoted in graduation speeches, and even etched into the side of a public bench in Cincinnati. People didn't always agree with J.D. Vance, but more and more, they started to understand him. And long after the debate had faded from headlines, something else remained. Not the shouting, not the edits, not the speculation, but a line that stayed. This story reminds us that silence isn't weakness. It can be a powerful act of self-respect. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, J.D. Vance chose stillness, not to avoid the truth, but to honor it. Jasmine's transformation too is striking, realizing that strength isn't always measured in decibels, but in dignity. Professor Hart didn't take sides. He simply offered context, reminding us how easily perception blurs without understanding. What lingers isn't who won, but the choices made when no one demanded them. What about you? Have you ever chosen silence, not to hide, but to stay true to yourself? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.